Hello, everyone. This is Craig from the Pacific War Channel, and this is Echoes of War, the newly titled podcast. I'm joined here by my co-host, Gaurav. How are you?
Hey Greg, great to be on here and looking forward to another great episode that we have in store for our listeners.
And I am very excited for this episode because it's a time period that I'm actually not very good in. In general, for the Napoleonic era, I'm, of course, pretty knowledgeable about what happens in North America because that's, the history. I'm from Quebec and it's a large part of the history over here. But what went on in Europe, I only know kind of the general public stuff. And I know that this battle is one of the big ones. And we're going to be talking about the Battle of the Nile. But before we jump into it, I just want to say, if you'd like to further support the channel, please go check out my YouTube membership over at the Pacific War Channel on YouTube, or you can check out my Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, you get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the next subjects we'll tackle. I actually put up a poll today, and it's an interesting bag of very different subjects I chose. I put the attack upon the German nuclear program as an option, how the Sicilian mob helped the Allies during World War II. For a curveball, I put let a patron interview me because I wanted to find something kind of different there. And for the last one, what did I put? How corruption led to the defeat of the Beiyang fleet. So that would have been during the First Sino-Japanese War. So a lot of very different subjects there. Please, if you do have a chance, go check it out. I think it's worth your while. We have quite a lot of exclusive podcasts by this point. But stating all of that, today's episode, to just give a brief introduction, is, like I said, the Battle of the Nile. It was also called by the French the Bataille d'Abukir. It was a pivotal naval clash fought in August of 1798 between the Royal Navy and the French Republican Navy. The confrontation occurred at Abukir Bay near the Nile Delta in Egypt, and it was actually the culmination of a 3-month Mediterranean campaign as, a large French convoy transported expeditionary forces led by none other than General Napoleon Bonaparte from Toulon to Alexandria. Now, I'm not going to give away anything, but there's going to be two admirals that are going to be facing off against each other. Of course, it's Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson, who's commanding the Royal Navy, against the French forces led by Vice Admiral François-Paul Bourrier d'Aguillier. And I guess most of this episode, Gareth, it's going to be in your control. So please let us start.
Thanks, Greg. So I think let's start with setting a bit of context. So the French Revolution obviously was the starting point of all hostilities. So after the removal of the monarchy in 1789, and then you have the Reign of Terror starting, the Republicans that took power, the Jacobins, they did not really have a lot of popular support at that time. Like most of them did support, but there was a good chunk of royalists or neutrals, and the rest of Europe was quite shocked. And they kind of decided that the best way to unify a country is have someone else to hate. And pretty much they declared a war on the Habsburg Empire or the Austrian Empire, which pretty much resulted in a situation that got in Russia, Sweden, Naples, Britain, Prussia, Portugal, and Spain all on the side against with Austria against France, which they managed to turn back the tide. Now, one of the key aspects or developments that take place in the backdrop is in 1794, the Jacobin government, so our famous guys like Danton, Robespierre, they're gone, executed by the same laws that they kind of put in place to deal summary justice on their
The
enemies
ironic,
of the Republic.
this is the ironic end to the Jacobins, yes.
And you have the Directory takes over. So it's a 5-man committee ruling France, which is pretty corrupt. Go figure. Now, what they want as they try to move, you know, expand France's war effort, which has now seen that the number of enemies drop Russia has not really contributed much. Prussia and Spain and Portugal have now withdrawn from the war. Is they will need to get rid of Austria. They are the most powerful enemy, and you have three simultaneous thrusts against the Austrian Empire. The two major thrusts are led by famous generals Jourdan and Moreau across the Rhine, and they're going to have pretty mixed success. Granted, this is kind of a bit sad given that they are given immense amount of resources, manpower, first priority on reinforcement, supplies, and pay to their men. And this is the best French units available. The Austrians will end up, it's kind of a mixed bag, but with the arrival of Archduke Charles, Austria actually holds off quite well. The diversionary arm is given to a commander, the Army of Italy. It's supposed to be a diversion, and that's given to General Bonaparte. And this is more in thanks for him preventing a royalist mob from overthrowing the Directory in Paris with his famous whiff of grape shot. Yep, just mow down the civilians. Anyways, Bonaparte, despite minimal support from the Directory, takes a series of stunning victories over the Austrians. That's, I think, a separate mini series we should definitely do. And as Austria forces are, diverted to the Italian theater in January of 1797, Bonaparte, whose stock is now quite high with the stunning successes, gets massive reinforcements from General Moreau and pretty much ends the war as he's able to move into Austria and threaten Vienna, which ultimately leads to an end of the war. There we have the Treaty of Campo Formio, which, there are a lot of lands are partitioned. So, Netherlands and most of Belgium goes to France. Venice is partitioned between the two powers, and the Italian states no longer belong to the Holy Roman Emperor. And then the usual that, oh yeah, we're at peace now, we're not going to fight each other. Now, one of the strange things that happened, which obviously leads to more animosity, is there were a lot of secret clauses which neither side really wanted to agree upon. In the sense, Austria did not want to cede the territory, but France demanded more. Is Britain still did not sign a peace or withdrew from the war effort. So France is there, and Britain has been a naval thorn, but France gets a good boost in 1797. Spain joins France in an alliance. Now, together, their navies are sizable and almost an equal to the British Navy in terms of size. They do have, I would say, like a gunpowder advantage in the sense French and Spanish ships tended to be more heavily armed in comparison to their Royal Navy equivalents. So seamanship is up for question. This leads to the British withdrawal from the Mediterranean, given its overall commitment to, policing, the Atlantic, India, maintaining a blockade over France from the Atlantic, and also engagements in the North Sea. They've withdrawn from the Mediterranean.
It's kind of
But
a
they do
testament
start,
to the Royal Navy, isn't it? The amount
indeed,
of distance, the amount of coverage they're providing, from one island nation, it's pretty insane. Yeah.
true. And you really got to consider the fact that Britain's navy is over 130 ships of the lines. And overall, with a crew for all roles, the Royal Navy alone is numbering around 140,000 people.
Yeah, that's insane for that time period. Holy
The
crap.
British Army is really small, but Britain knows this, but
Yeah, but
their
historically, the
navy
British
is,
Army always has been small. Yeah.
and yeah, so now France is trying to figure out how they can hurt Britain. Napoleon comes up with the idea that if I go towards Egypt, I sail, I capture Egypt, And then, you know, I will sever their link with the empire because keep in mind, Egypt is controlled by Britain but is still part of the Ottoman Empire. It's kind of a strange situation. But, the Ottomans, the old man of Europe, they've been on the decline for a few decades now, and
Actually,
they're just going to continue.
yeah, I wasn't aware that the Ottomans still had a claim to Egypt during this time. I thought it was
It was
fully a
still,
protectorate under Britain.
it was still nominally,
Hmm.
the keyword nominally under the Ottoman Empire.
Okay,
And
so
at the same time, Napoleon was like, "Yep, I'll also use this, and I will go, link up with Tipu Sultan, who was a king in South India rebelling against the British East India Company."
mhm.
And so the idea was that, this will cut Britain from India because Britain used Egypt to transport a lot of material from India to Britain much quicker. Otherwise, you have a really long voyage around Africa.
Ironically, this is identical to the World War II North African campaign situation with the Suez Canal. So it's to cut off the,
True enough.
yeah.
And this is, in a way, kind of sound thinking because a lot of the wealth Britain generates, which is used to sustain the war effort, comes from trade. Cut off its trade arm, British support falls. And given how much we know Britain later is going to bankroll Austria, Prussia, Russia in the later wars, that's saying something. Not to mention the current British Prime Minister, William Pitt, is quite opposed to Napoleon.
Hmm.
And, he's even put spying and civil service, stopping of civil gatherings and a quota system for the Royal Navy because he's boosting the Royal Navy's manpower as we speak.
And economically, Britain's actually coming off of, the Revolutionary War, which did absolutely do some economic damage to them. So, hmm.
I was reading into this. Britain's national debt in around 1783 was about 283 million pounds. Around 24 million pounds would have to just be paid in interest alone.
Yeah, because I know
And
the history of this period when it comes to what's going to be the Opium Wars and the silver. This is kind of when the silver deficit trend is going to start now. They're
true.
going they're
And
actually going to get involved in the opium smuggling. Yeah, right around this time.
yeah, but this 243 million, 24 million every year
Hmm.
interest. Sorry, 8 million a year has to just be paid in interest alone. And that's one third of the British budget.
Yeah.
Keep in
Hmm.
mind, 24 million back then was a lot of
Oh
money.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
24 million is still a lot today, but it's like probably in the billions today.
Yeah.
Anyways, one thing about William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, he actually gets Britain's finances under control. So at the outbreak of the War of the First Coalition, their principal debt amount is now at 170 million. He's reduced a good chunk of it. So you can see Britain is going to start expanding its financial might. So Napoleon's expedition to Egypt is quite a good one. Makes sense. But the directory does not really want to sanction it for that. They just want to sanction it for the simple reason they know Napoleon is very politically ambitious. He has a core of really capable generals and loyal men. So they just want them away from France. So at Toulon, Napoleon assembles a large invasion column with an army of at least 35,000 soldiers. Most of them are his, veterans for the wars in Italy. And this is also, I guess, including, famous names like General Lance, Marshal Murat. So it's quite a talented core of his that is going to be deployed. And they leave towards the second half of May, May 19th from Toulon. And they first arrive off one of our favorite places on North Africa, Malta, during a North Africa campaign on the 9th of June. And Bonaparte wanted to dock the Knights of the Knights Hospitaller, who have been on Malta for over 2.5 centuries now, from a gift from Charles V, refuse, and there's an invasion, and they surrender the island, and they are given money, but Malta is pretty much given over to France. So right now, France, for all intents and purposes, has annexed Malta, and so yeah, they head off to Greece, like on 19th, about a week later after the surrender. They are on their way to Egypt, but he's left behind 4,000 men to garrison the island. In the meantime, while he was sailing to Malta, so this is just after his expedition starts its journey from Toulon, the British, for the first time in about a year, have re-entered the Mediterranean. Given the untenable possession and its other commitments, you can see why they had done. So, Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson is given a message by Earl St. Vincent to investigate what's going on. They had reports of a large French fleet gathering at Toulon, and they wanted to know what. And this was like really a small fleet, a squadron. It's not even a fleet. It's just three third-rate ships of the line and three frigates. And despite this, in July, as they're entering and crossing Gibraltar, they are really wrecked. Sorry, towards Toulon, my bad, which is just 2 days after the French have departed. They're struck by heavy gale force winds. The frigates and ships of the line are completely blown away. Nelson's own flagship, HMS Vanguard, lost its topmast, and yeah, they have to shelter off Sardinia, and the frigates were pretty much blown away out of the Mediterranean. Yeah, so he loses time. So 7th June, as he's getting the repairs done. Uh, a reinforcement fleet under Captain Tourbridge comes to join Nelson, and this is under the orders of Admiral Sir Earl St. Vincent. He's now has 10 more ships of the line and a fourth rate that have joined. And his orders have now changed from interception to from investigation to interception. And unfortunately, he does not have any frigates now. So I think when we get to it, we'll talk about the ships in a bit more detail. So, they stop over at Elba and Naples, where Sir William Hamilton and his very beloved wife, who Nelson is gonna love, and the Royal Navy going to hate, Emma Hamilton, are there. But Naples, understandably, is reluctant to officially help, since they don't want any French reprisals. But on 22nd June, they get information that the French have sailed eastward from Malta on the night of 16th June. So it doesn't really take him much to deduce that, yep, they're going to Egypt. Now, this is a crazy thing. On the evening of 22nd June, Nelson, whose warships are just making a straight, direct course to Egypt, actually on the night of 22nd, pass the French invasion convoy. They sail right through them. Now, keep in mind, Nelson is just having a war fleet. He has no supply ships, because ships of the line this time can carry supplies for up to 6 months. So
Yeah, and of course,
they're
Napoleon
quite
has
good.
a supply convoy, so it's going to be a lot slower. Yeah, makes sense.
And troop transports, because he's
Yeah.
transporting thousands of soldiers
Mm.
to get even the fleet. And he actually reaches Egypt, Alexandria on 28th June, sorry, 28th of June. He sees there are no French here, and he meets with the Ottomans, who are a bit suspicious of like, what the hell are you even trying to tell? And he kind of sails up towards the Levant. And this is such a comical thing, because on the 29th of June, the French scout ships start arriving off Alexandria. And yeah, so Napoleon is kind of worried that, there was such a close encounter, and he quickly launches his land invasion. Nelson, on the other hand, goes back to Sicily because he's like, he has, no intel right now. But about a month later, on 19th of July, on Sicily, he gets the intel that he needs. And by 24th, they are resupplied, and they start moving towards like on Alexandria. Now let's take a look back at the French situation. So the job of the fleet beyond the transport and guarding is providing a supply link to France. And they also contain the treasury for Napoleon's army.
Oh wow, so the treasury is there because okay, that
Yep.
makes sense in that time period. Yeah. Jeez.
Yeah, the pay chests and all are there. However, and they have to obviously protect Napoleon from like a seaborne invasion as he conducts his land campaign. Initially, the orders were to harbor the French fleet at Alexandria, but the ships of the line could not stay there. The harbor was too shallow, so they moved to Abukir Bay, and yeah, it was like a nearby bay, or else if not, they can move to the island of Corfu. But Vice Admiral Brues, I can't pronounce the entire name, it's just going to be too long to pronounce his entire name. Vice Admiral Brues, who is in command of the fleet, insists on, you know, staying in Abukir Bay. And even though Admiral Blanquet insisted that we should maybe set sail for open water and engage Nelson, he anchors himself at Abukir Bay. Now, unfortunately for him, he has a problem. Napoleon's taken a lot of supplies. He can send over shore parties to get water and food from the locals, but the locals, Bedouin tribes, do not like them. So his sailors are getting shot. So a lot of the Marines on the French ships, they have to be sent over with the shore parties to provide escort. So at any given point of time, around a third of the sailors and men are not even on the ship. So this is not really a good situation. So before we get into the fact that on the 1st of August, Nelson has arrived and both fleets know that there's going to be a fight, let's talk a little bit of maybe the ships of the line and sailing here. So this is the age of sail. So you have wooden ships, which are just heavy gun platforms. Most of the crew are just going to be, you'll have a small selection of officers and support staff in terms of carpenters, surgeons, cooks, the surgeons assistants, and the navigators. You'll have maybe 150 to 200 Marines or sailors, soldiers on the ship. The bulk of the crew are just used for like maintaining the ship and in combat manning your guns. And so you can just imagine each ship having 2 to 3 gun decks, and that's all the decks are for. It's just for guns. And ships are called ships of the line, but there are various ratings to it, which is just dependent on the firepower carried by each ship. So no doubt the first and foremost are the first rates. Now this is what any fleet admiral will use as his flagship. These are all ships that are armed with 100+ cannons. Considering the smallest cannons tend to be at least a 12-pounder, with the ones on the lower gun deck each firing a 34, 32-pound cannonball. You can imagine the firepower that these vessels have. So they're obviously very few, but you don't want to get a broadside by them, considering their broadsides are greater than the total firepower of other ships. Then you have the second rate, which consists of 90 to 98 guns. And they kind of were the flagships for admirals if they were serving overseas. So if you had like, the British fleet of, say, North America, the admiral will be having a second rate. They were the only difference besides the guns was they were kind of a bit cheaper to build. So you could kind of afford to lose these, relatively speaking. Then the most important were the two-deck third-rate ships of the line. This is the bulk of all the sailing ships at the time. They could range between 64 to 80 guns, with the British predominantly using a 74 gun layout. And for smaller squadrons, they were going to be the flagships. Then you had the fourth rate, which are gonna only be in your line of battle if needed, and they are 50 to 60 guns. Then you had the fifth rates, which are also known as frigates. These are scout ships mostly when sailing with the fleet and ferry messages, or in the direst of emergencies, they will be used in combat. And then you had sloops and brigs, which are like six rates, 22 to 28 guns. They in a battle they are really just used only as a messaging ship between the various ships of the line. Now there's a big, and obviously as you can see, you form up. The main tactic is form up in a line of battle, and ideally if you can cross the enemy's T, you can rake them. So that is maybe the forward 2 or 4 cannons of the enemy could fire on you, but you're going to be able to deliver a broadside.
To
That's called
explain to
raking
the
fire.
audience, like it applies to
It's
the
crossing the
age of
T.
sail, crossing the T. So if you were to put your hands in front of you and you're pointing your fingers at each other, the forward
I think if I
cannon.
can just show this,
Well, I
you
don't know
know,
if most people will have audio, mind you.
yeah, but
Yeah,
if the enemy is facing north, you want to move perpendicular to them
yeah,
so that they are not able to fire with their heavy guns,
mhm,
but you're going to be able to deliver a devastating salvo,
yeah,
a full broadside. So
and
that was
yeah,
also called raking fire.
yeah.
Now, here's an interesting thing I found is the doctrine tactics. The British fleet actions were quite rare. So whenever it is the British admirals, not only Nelson, everyone would try to focus on complete destruction or capturing of the enemy vessels. So you would see the British were okay with sinking ships of the enemy. And when they fought, their aim was slightly lower so that they would be impacting the hull of the enemy ships. Whereas the French, they never really wanted to do anything but preserve the fleet. So if they are drawn into combat, they would be aiming higher. So they attack the masts of the British Navy. So that would like not let them chase the French fleet and they can withdraw. But the biggest difference is training. Britain, in the time between battles, the British captains were encouraged and they did train all their men in combat drills, practice gunnery. So British gun crews were able to fire faster and more accurately than the French sailors could ever. And Brewers knew this. And yeah, and I think I should just mention one thing. There was a rule of war. When ships of the line engage, they will not engage, fifth rates or below. If there are equal sized prizes or enemies to be fought. But if the frigate will fire first, well, protection waived.
I
Keep that in
would
mind. We will.
want to mention
Yeah.
one thing because I think a lot of people from my audience are World War II oriented and naval battle kind of guys. And all of
Mhm.
this sounds identical to what you would think is like modern naval combat. But you have to remember, this is the age of sail, and something that was critical during that time, especially when it was like when you were trying to cross the T of the enemy, they had terms like windward and leeward. So as you can imagine,
Yeah,
age of sail, you're using wind to go, your distances. So the directions of the wind, which could be windward, which is upwind, as like I guess as a point of reference, you could say windward would be considered upwind, whereas leeward is downwind. So when you were facing your enemy, whichever, one of you is like trying to basically gain an advantage on the other one, you're trying to direct yourself, going with the wind so you can go faster so that you could cross the T of your enemy. So this is actually it's more complex than that, but this is a big thing for the Age of Sail.
true. And it's called holding the weather gauge. That's the term that was used because whoever has a wind on their side and they know the directions, they have the initiative. So they can choose, they are the ones who will choose when battle will take place or if they need to withdraw. Again, as we mentioned in our other videos, initiative. So, okay, so now we look at, and maybe we'll just talk a little bit of the admirals right now. Bruce is quite an uh, ironic admiral in the sense he was a full-on nobleman who escaped the French Revolution with his head on his shoulders, got promoted, no thanks to Bonaparte's help. But yeah, he never left France. But again, like many of the French admirals, he was very cautious and adhere to the doctrine of that we need to preserve the fleet. Whereas we now have Britain's, I would go as far and call him the greatest admiral of Britain, and one of the greatest in the world behind Admiral Lee, but that's a discussion for another time. Nelson is quite an egoistical guy. He loves praise, and if you tell praises about him, he's gonna love you. But that's quite a character for the ages. But in terms of attack, he was probably the most innovative for his time, and to many of his peers, reckless. But the one thing I really like about what he does is he's able to inspire his men and he lets the captains under him take the initiative. They're learning from him, which, as you can see in this battle, is going to be like, very critical. And that's actually like, led to the formation of this group called the Nelsonic Band of Brothers. So, all the admirals who served with him in both, at the Nile and later his famous victory at Trafalgar, quite a lot of them reached flag rank. So I think at the Battle of Trafalgar, of all the captains that served under Nelson, only two of them never even reached the rank of rear admiral. Five of them even reaching the rank of a full admiral. So that's quite a great thing, if you ask me, when you empower your subordinates to, take the initiative. So on the, so when you have the Battle of the Nile, so Bruce is aware of his shortcomings when the British fleet is sighted. So what he's done is Abukir Bay, ahead of the main landmass, is a shoal and an island. So that island is lightly garrisoned by a few cannons, but they're not really going to pose much of a threat. But what he's done is he's tried to position his ships just ahead of the shoal so that he does not have to prepare the landwards facing cannons of his. All his guns and the crew that is available so that they can only man one side. As I said earlier, most of them, a good chunk of them are right now on shore, getting supplies for the fleet. And then engage the British. And he also had the idea of tying like a spring cable between each ship. And each ship was positioned about 160 yards from each other. So that with the cable tied between the masts of the masts of each ship, You're forming an unbreakable line, and it will not let any British ship move into between the two ships to provide raking fire. So his ships are going to be pretty much stationary throughout the battle. This is what his intended battle plan is. And as the British ships will try to come down, they will be able to use their seaward facing guns and blast. And here they have an advantage because one of Brewers' ships, so then Brewers has a fleet of 13 ships of the line. However, um, all but two of the third rate ships have 74 guns. The other two have 80 guns, so slight firepower advantage. But his flagship is the Lorient, which is a massive first rate ship of the line with 120 guns. And the British know this. They know they are facing a first rate. And Nelson will plan to combat it. But consider the fact that their broadside alone will have 60 guns. It's a 2-to-1 advantage in firepower to the Lorient. He also has 4 frigates, which are kind of anchored behind the main line. They're not really going to take any active part. However, by staying stationary, he has given the weather gauge to Nelson, who will be using the wind to his advantage. Now, let's discuss the British plan. So the British are hugging the coast of Abukir Bay as they are moving in. And they just have a really old map of the shoals. But what Nelson has done has formed all of his ships into a column. And they're going to go just skirting around the shoals to avoid running aground, but not expose themselves more than necessary to enemy fire. And then they are to move down the French line and start engaging the vanguard. His plan is to kind of move in a way that each of his ships will come and they will kind of like, gang up on the French vanguard and center so that he's only engaging half the French fleet with his entire fleet. And because of the direction of the wind, the French ships further down the line will not be able to move up to support the vanguard and center. And he's even planned for 3 ships to engage the Lorient itself,
And
which is what he's gonna do.
I've noticed I was interested to see. I was looking just at some information on this, and under the French camp, there was a French officer, Comte Admiral Armand Blanquet, who insisted to not take up the stance and instead go into open water so they had mobility. But apparently, the
Mhm.
rest of the captains on Debris just agreed with him that anchoring the line of battle inside the bay would present like the strongest tactic for confronting Nelson. But as you're mentioning, like it's quite obvious the tactic that Nelson would take. Yes, just don't fully show all of your ships to the entire line of the French. Just divide and conquer, take some side hit. Yeah, it makes perfect
Exactly.
sense. And they control all the mobility, so it's in
True,
Nelson's
but at the
hands.
same time, Brues, I can't totally fault him also for going to sea because the seamanship qualities of the Royal Navy is far superior to the French. It's not even a contest. It's not like say how you have the Grande Armée
Yeah.
fighting like say the revamped armies of Europe. In seamanship quality, the British are going to destroy the French if it was an open battle, if you ask me. So, and given that a lot of his men are not on board, I think given that situation, I think he probably had no other choice but to take this set of action because it would take a lot of hours for him to get the men on board, prepare for sailing, and you're already losing the initiative to Nelson. So
Hmm. Yeah.
I think if you really look at it like that, so yeah. So by 4 o'clock on the 1st of August, Nelson's fleet has arrived. And yeah, so they slow down so that it lulls Brewers into a false sense of security. Because he wanted some of his ships, which was the HMS Swiftsure and Alexander and Culloden to catch up. But because they slowed down, Brewers falsely believed Nelson is not going to risk a nighttime engagement. Well, wild guess, because Nelson has already decided that he's attacking at night.
I
But
mean, it goes without saying it favors the person who has mobility at night because the
true.
targets are going to be, more stable for the French. Yeah, it's just okay.
Yeah. Now Nelson, he prepares the ships for combat. They're attaching, springs on their anchor cables. So this just is going to make them more stable when they fire, because when you're firing and taking fire, the ship's going to rock quite a bit. All right, and you know, it increased the maneuverability, which you will see here when they have to make some tight turns. This is going to play a big, big role. And obviously, we had, proper lighting was put so that in the night, the British ships are going to know who's who. You don't want, because in this, with a lot of smoke that's going to come up, it's going to be very hard to distinguish between friend or foe. So yeah, it at least illuminated the British far enough, so at least at a high level, you know that broadly this is where a British ship is going to be. And as they were preparing for battle, Nelson has a dinner with the officers on his ship, which is now the third-rate HMS Vanguard, which is in the middle of the British line, I might add. Is before this time tomorrow, I shall have gained a peerage of Westminster Abbey, which means I'm either going to be ennobled or I'm going to be buried in Westminster Abbey as a British war hero. So, yeah, playing on that entire vanity. So, yeah, maybe I should just take a minute to just talk about the order of the battle. Is you have HMS Goliath, Zealous, Orion, Audacious, Theseus, which are the first five ships of the British line, and the captain of HMS Goliath, Thomas Foley, has quite a difficult task because they don't have any accurate maps, and he's leading the line. They have to kind of take plumbing depths to ensure that every ship can pass safely. And he's going to make a big decision. Then Nelson in the middle with HMS Vanguard. Then you have HMS Minotaur, Defense, Bellefonte, Majestic, Leander, Alexander Swiftsure, and Culloden, Captain Turbridge's ship, forming up the rear of the line. So as the British are moving, you know, there is the Zealous is taking the soundings, and then as they move forward, we see the situation where the first French ship Guerrier Star is opening fire because it's on the firing angle, but luckily they're at range, so the British are not taking much damage. And this is where we have HMS Goliath's captain seeing that Brewers miscalculated the distance between his ships and the shoal. So Brewers' battle plan was to not keep very minimal distance between the shoals and open water. This was to ensure that the British cannot come in between the shoal and his line.
Mhm.
But Goliath has this scene that, yep, they've left enough gap for us. So let's go.
I'll just say to the
And
audience, because I'm currently looking at the actual map that shows the battle lines. If you were to look at it and you were to picture the bay curving in leftwards, basically there's like a very small nook that was left that allows the British to just kind of curve around dangerously close to the shoals. But this gives
mhm,
them almost, a 360 to circle some of the ships on, the Vanguard. Yeah.
yeah, so he decides to, and as I said, Nelson has given his officers the initiative. They can make tactical decisions during battle. Goliath decides to exploit this gap. And as we will see, um, the other ships, we will see Zealous, Orion, Audacious, and Theseus all following the Goliath. So HMS Vanguard, Nelson's flagship, is inadvertently going to lead the second column, you could say. But this is a brilliant move. And at the same time, um, the British do suffer a blow. Is at the end, like, this is around approaching 7 p.m. at night. HMS Culloden, the final ship of the line, with the fading light, misjudged the shoal and ran aground. So Nelson is down one ship. It's not going to sink, but it's not going to play any part in the battle. And you have, the HMS Leander and Mutiny, the brig, the fourth rate ship, and the sloop trying to tow it out, but the Culloden is kind of wedged well on the shore. It's run aground. It's going to suffer some pretty serious damage to its hull, but they're not going to be able to participate in the battle, unfortunately. Now, as the ships come, like, Goliath, Theseus, Audacious, Zealous, and Orion um, come, the French vanguard is destroyed because now they are attacking from the side where Bruese's guns are not even prepared for combat there. The gun ports are still down because he did not count on this maneuver happening.
Yeah, so again, for the audience, you have to imagine more or less the French are in a continuous line, and one side of all of their ships are prepared to engage the enemy. They do not expect to engage the enemy. We'll say to their left. If you're looking at the picture from my angle, they think the direction of battle's to the right. They don't expect anything from the left, and they're going to get hit from both.
Exactly. Now, what? Now this is like a funny. Well, I don't know if funny is the right term, but kind of sad incident is for the French. Is as HMS Orion is making its turn. It takes a wider turn, more closer to the shoals, but it's not going to be in any trouble because it's seen that the Goliath and Zealous have now dropped their anchors and are firing broadsides into the opposing fleets. Because right now they are engaging the French ships Spartius, Conquer, and Guerriere. So he needs to take a wider turn so that he does not get held up. The one of the four French frigates is anchored nearby, and that is the frigate Cerise. And Orion is not even looking at it. Because the rule of war is a ship of the line will not engage a smaller ship if there are equal prizes about, and there are plenty of equal prizes. But the frigate's captain decided to open fire on the Orion as it went by, as it was approaching, sorry. And now the protection waiver that you would say for this gentleman's conduct of rule of war has been waived.
Yeah.
And Orion passes quite close to the frigate and opens a broadside. That frigate is done. It's sunk.
One could
Oh,
say it became very serious for the Sérieux. It means serious in French, yeah.
yep, yep. So then you also have HMS Theseus and Audacious also joining in, and they managed to move, and the French ships Pepple, Souverain, and Aquilon are also now being engaged from their port side, their unprepared side now. And Britain is just enjoying this. So you have this happening. And yes, at around, then, we have Vanguard is now going to be leading the second line. Vanguard, Minotaur, and Defense, they move, but they now engage the main battle line of the French. And in this situation, we see that Nelson is engaging the Petit. Sorry, my French is horrible. And Minotaur engages the Aquilon, and HMS Defense engages Pepple Souverain. So then, seeing that they are now heavily engaged, the ships behind them, which are HMS Bellefonte and Majestic, pass by and now move to the center. And unfortunately, Bellefonte misjudges his anchorage and is in direct firing line of the Lorient, which is prepared on that side, on its seaward side. And it takes a battering. And unfortunately, also the other ship, which is Majestic, you know, they almost collide, but it does end up, coming near the ship Tonnant and moves further down the line that it's just in front of what you would call the rear line of the French. And unfortunately, it is now going to be taking fire from multiple ships as well.
Yeah, from the diagram I'm looking at, it's the only ship that actually ventures that far off to engage those
Yeah.
ships. Yeah.
Unfortunately, for the French, the Lorient is also taking a beating from Bellerophon. So
Hmm.
it's horribly outdone, but it's dishing out a beating to the capital ship.
Yeah.
And, you know, we see Admiral Bruez is severely wounded in the hand and face at this time, very early in the
Ouch.
battle. Yeah. Now, at around 7 p.m., Guerrier, the first French, has been completely dismasted, that is, his masts are gone and battered. And for contrast, HMS Zealous, which was engaging it, has hardly been hit. And, so the Guerrier was not prepared and it soon, strikes its color. You know, that at 9 o'clock it strikes its color. So, strikes its color is the term for surrender.
Hmm.
And then Coquerant, which was just behind it, is much more defeat is destroyed. And by about but unlike the Guerrier, it does surrender a bit more easily. But we do have that HMS Goliath has suffered quite a bit of damage as well. So its masts are pretty badly damaged. Then Audacious is now moving forward and engaging. And this Petit, you gotta help me with the pronunciations of these French ships, right?
Spartiate, the Spartan.
Spartiate.
By the way, I thought the
Yeah.
English names for ships were ridiculous, but if I were to translate, the French ships are pretty hilarious. Their names are pretty funny. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the next ship, Spartiate, is it has been supported by Aquilon, which is also fighting Minotaur. Then yeah, Spartiate does cause the British a bit of a worry because one of its shots, because it was in position at around 8:30 to 4, raking fire into Nelson's approaching vanguard, HMS Vanguard, and in that Nelson suffers a splinter wound over his eye that it's bleeding very heavily. That he's like, I'm lost. Please remember me to my wife. Has a really dramatic death. He's taken down to the lower decks, below the gun decks to the surgeon's room. Was like, yeah, you just need a few stitches and a painkiller. Like, well, they don't have painkillers, so he just stitches him, patches him up, and within no time, Nelson's back up, commanding as if nothing ever happened. Um, so the reason is Nelson wanted to be in the action. The surgeon had said, "Yeah, you better rest up," but well, Nelson's not gonna do that.
There's no way in this confrontation. Absolutely not. Yeah.
Uh, so we now have, the Aquilon and
Poupe souverain.
Spartiate also, now being removed in the fight by about
Mhm.
9:30. Now, Defense and Orion are attacking Purple Sourion, which is now the fifth ship of the line on the French line. And, at the same time, they are also engaging Lorient. The Lorient's also being engaged. Their captain and officers are falling like flies. So Bruez is injured quite badly. And then, the captain of the ship, Captain Suarez, is also injured on the thigh.
Might I add just to the
And
audience, because if the audience obviously can't visualize this unless they have the map in front of them, at this point we're talking about multiple ships hitting, but you have to picture in your head about little over yeah, under half of the French forces are being engaged, and they're basically
mhm.
being circled like hornets. The British are coming
Yeah,
at all
you could,
sides. Yeah.
at the moment, you could say, if you include the Lorient and Tonnant, who form the center, you only have half the French ships engaged. But this is what Nelson counted on, where we mentioned that the weather gauge. The other ships, even if they want to help, they cannot move forward. The wind is not in their favor. Well, I guess that's the thing about the Age of Sail. So with Purple Sauvignon being quite badly damaged, its captain ordered the ship's anchor cable to be cut to kind of drift down the line. Unfortunately, Lorient thought this was a British ship and opened a broadside.
Oh shit.
Yeah. Then, so Purple Sauvignon anchored not far, but it was just pretty much done. Now, the ship just next on the line, and which is just ahead of Lorient, is the third rate Franklin. Now, this is the 80 gun third rate. So everything else has, except the Orion, all the third rates are 74 guns in this battle. You know, but however, their captain is Conte Admiral or Rear Admiral Blanquet, the guy was opposed to the fight. He and the captain were both badly injured, and they also have like the small arms locker in the ship does catch fire, and the crew has to like frantically put that out. And yeah, so they are also in trouble. So you've had the entire French vanguard that's now completely destroyed. Now it's not going totally Nelson's way. HMS Bellerophon, which was also dealing a bit of punishment to the Orion, is unfortunately taking a brutal beating. And at almost 8 o'clock, its mizzen and topmast, mainmast have both collapsed and fires are broken out. And the ship has suffered over 200 casualties, which is approximately a third of its contingent. So, captain of the Bellerophon, he realizes that that we are really in a bad situation, and he orders the ships to drift away. While it was under fire from the next ship, friend Tonnant, it has been, you know, they managed to successfully drift away and are not going to be fired upon. Even though HMS Majestic almost did, but it did not. So at least the British had better friendly fire luck. But yeah, around the same time on the Lorient, Admiral Bruez is again being hit mid-drift by a cannonball that's almost cut him in half. But he's tough. He does not want to be carried below. And unfortunately, he succumbs to his wounds 15 minutes later.
Oh my God. So what, like a chunk out of his midsection must have just got like blown off?
Yep.
Oh, that's a hell of a way to go.
Yeah. And at the same time, Alexander, so you at the same time now as HMS Alexander and Swiftsure have arrived. Now, they're amongst the last ships of the British line, just ahead of the Culloden. So now the entire British line is engaging. They make a beeline right between Lorient. So Alexander moves a bit further south. Okay, I have no idea why my Alexa just started to start.
Yeah, no worries.
But yeah, so HMS Swiftsure moves slightly north of Lorient and anchors right between the Franklin and Lorient. It's able to pour raking fire into both ships. So, one broadside for Franklin, one broadside for Lorient, and these ships can't even reply. It's not even funny. And at the same time, Alexander will move between Tonnant and Lorient on its southern side. So Lorient, after taking the beating from Bellerophon, is now being raked by broadsides from two different ships without the ability to fight back. Because it's also taken a heavy loss of life. And yeah, so we have that, and they move in. Now, at 9 o'clock is one of the most significant events of the battle taking place. British observers, they see that on the lower decks of Lorient, a fire has broken out. Now, it's no surprise because so Captain HMS Swiftsure, their captain and Alexander, they both decide to take actions. They start firing on that point. And that fire on the lower gun decks has now weakened. And that is going to expose into the deck that's kind of below, like the storage decks, which is below the water line, where the food, water for keeping a ship provisioned for several months is stored, and the grand magazine. All your gunpowder and cannonballs are also there. And we're talking about 80, 90 plus tons of gunpowder alone, not even talking about the weight of the shots. Yeah. Then I think when they see like by 10, 15 minutes after that, where, the fire is completely out of control and it's now spread up that even the ship's rigging on its mast are on fire. So the nearest British ships, Swiftsure, Alexander, and even the Orion, they all stopped firing and they started moving away from the Lorient because everyone knows what's going to happen. And they've already taken measures. They've spread tons of water from their pumps onto the deck. Gun ports are closed to protect from debris, and they have to get away. And at 10 o'clock at night, the fire finally breaches the protection of the Grand Magazine on the Lorient. And you just have an insane explosion that, seems in the nearby ships were completely ripped apart. And, wreckage is flying and hitting all the ships. And, the British ships, Alexander and Swiftsure, also got some fire debris, and so did Franklin. Though, Franklin did take a bit of a smaller damage from an explosion that was started by a fire. These three ships were able to contain the blaze. And yeah, it was such a thing for 10 minutes. The entire battle stopped across the entire line. Well, if you have such a big explosion,
I
it's
mean, it's not
bound
every
to take
day.
your.
Yeah. It's not every day you see this kind of thing back then. This must have been a spectacle to see.
It was. I think it was said like, the explosion, some debris fell over 500 meters away. And the Lorient, like about 90% of the survivors were blown apart by this explosion. They were dead. And maybe 100 or so dived in, and over the next 10 minutes, the British ships nearby, they lowered lifeboats to rescue these men, and only 70 survivors were picked up. And keep in mind, there were over 1,000 casualties on the Lorient alone for the French. Just one ship. Yeah, then I think after 10 minutes, this was also an order by Nelson. He did order his ships to lower the lifeboats to get these men aboard. Then Franklin, which is like, the only ship you could say of the vanguard and center left of the French, resumes the battle, is fire on Swiftsure. And, the Franklin is pretty much bombarded within a few minutes to submission. So now you have the entire French center and vanguard destroyed or captured. Well, not captured yet, but they've struck down their colors. They're not in a position to fight. And only the Tonnant remains engaged. And, while, HMS Majestic, which is engaging it for quite a while, has taken a beating, the Tonnant also is, taken, is defeated. And one thing I gotta add, the Tonnant's captain, Captain Du Petit Tuas, what a guy. Like, that guy had audacity because during the battle, both of his legs and an arm was shot off. And to ensure that the colors are not going to be struck down, he had them hammered into the wood near him and was still commanding the ship.
Jeez. Jeez. Okay.
I mean, that's hardcore, I would say.
Yeah.
And yeah, they did finally strike its cables, and you know they did move south towards the rear division, the southern division or the rear guard under Admiral Villeneuve. And yeah, they just do nothing. And it's quite surprising because the last four French ships of the line under Admiral Villeneuve, they never really engaged. And he's going to receive a lot of, um, you know, criticism for this. So towards the morning, as the British cruisers by now are utterly exhausted themselves. You know, Villeneuve decides to take the remaining four ships of the line and the three frigates to make a break and escape. And only his ship, what do you call, the Gualmetel, escapes successfully, and the Generox, which is another third rate, they managed to successfully escape along with two frigates, but Justice and Diane, but frigates are not really that important. And unfortunately, they did hit one of their own frigates, and that other frigate was also, which was the frigate Artemis, which I guess would mean Artemis.
Yes, it's just a translation of Artemis. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, they kind of leave. And the funny thing is, amongst the other two ships of the line that were trying to escape with Villeneuve, the Timolan tried to join, but the escape, but it ran itself aground. So it was kind of captured. Then by the morning of the third, it's pretty much battle is over. The French fleet is completely destroyed. Now, with the destruction of Lorient, a lot of the paychecks of Napoleon's soldiers have also gone down.
Might I add
And
props to you, Gareth, for having to go through this episode because I'm realizing how absolutely brutal it is for someone who doesn't speak French. Because just for the audience to know, apart from like the ship names, every single French commander has about 5 to 6 names in his name. So the guy that he had
yeah,
mentioned before, his name was officially he was a Commodore Aristide Audbert du Petit Trois. It's like every name I'm seeing on the list is like ridiculous back then. But carry on.
true. But yeah, so the battle's now over, and it's a decisive success for the British. So in terms of ship losses, HMS Goliath, HMS Theseus, and Vanguard and Culloden have a lot of and Majestic. They suffer hull damage. A few others like Defense and Leander and Alexander pretty much only have mass damage. But in terms of number of men, the British have suffered 218 dead and 678 wounded. So about 900 casualties, out of which 200 were on HMS Majestic, 200 on Bellerophon, and 100 plus on Nelson's flagship on Vanguard. Minotaur also had about 90 casualties, and Alexander had about 70 casualties. So these were the ones where the British casualties were more. So the French losses are estimated at about 3,500, out of which only 1,000 or 1,200 were captured and 2,000 killed, a bulk, half of them from the Lorient alone.
Yeah, that explosion, it reminds me of like the Arizona Pearl Harbor almost, the story. It must have been a
Yeah,
hell of a thing to see.
true. But the British, in terms of officers, they do lose one captain, Captain Westcott, who was the commander of HMS Majestic, and 5 lieutenants and 10 junior officers among the dead. Nelson and 3 other captains were wounded, and 6 other lieutenants were wounded. But he's not suffered any ship loss. On the French, Admiral was killed, Admiral Blanquet was wounded, 4 captains were killed, and 7 other wounded. So it's a pretty big thing. So in terms of absolute hull losses, was the French only lost 2 ships, which is the Lorient and Timolan, which is kind of scuttled, even though it was captured by the British. And the 2 ships of the line, Guamentel and Genero, along with the frigates Justice and Diane, escaped successfully. However, amongst the other ships, they all were captured by the Royal Navy. So not only have the French lost a good chunk of its fleet, the British have also going to make use of this.
Oh yeah, big time.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think about 6 of these 9 ships that are captured will actually see service with the Royal Navy. So it's pretty big. And in a strategic sense, this has kind of crippled the ability of Bonaparte to keep a successful campaign in the region because he's not going to have any supplies. And that would actually lead to him by 1799 to return with just a few soldiers and his generals, while the rest of his army would actually hold out till 1800, but with no supplies and reinforcements, surrender. But yeah, this side of the Ottomans will no longer be involved in the war after the Second Coalition, and the British trade links are kept intact. And when the day of the morning arrived, one of the seamen, John Nicol on Goliath, said, "I went to the deck to view the state of the fleet, and an awful sight it was. The whole bay was covered with dead bodies, mangled, wounded, and scorched. Not a bit of clothes on them except their trousers." So this is pretty much like, a lot of the men from, the Orient. Then, yeah, so Nelson does spend a few days, and he did say victory is not a name strong enough for such a scene. So there's no immediate return of Nelson because for 2 weeks he's going to be anchored over here so that his ships can conduct the repairs and, they can, get the wounded, safe. So Nelson's wound, by the way, was supposed to be 3 inches long with the cranium exposed for 1 inch.
Oof. Yeah, that's pretty nasty.
And yeah, and he would unfortunately suffer pain from this for the rest of his life. So, on 5th August, the Leanders dispatched to Cadiz with the messages to Nelson's commander, Earl St. Vincent. And, the British do let a lot of the prisoners to go, but, they keep 200 prisoners and the rest are given on parole. But Napoleon is like, yeah, I don't give a shit. You guys are now fighting on the army. And, Nelson does take the officers prisoners on Vanguard, and there was supposed to be like, a Nelson whose eyesight was still a bit weak after his injury. He offered a toothpick to one French officer who lost his teeth and passed the snuff box to another officer whose nose has been torn off from combat.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, so by then on 10th August, the main messages started departing, to the government in India by, Thomas Duvat, and then, it does reach, Britain. And to just show how slow communication is, Bonaparte himself only knows about this disaster on 14th August.
Jeez, yeah, it is long. Okay.
Indeed. So, you know, um, when Bonaparte was said to have been given this, he read it without emotion before calling the messenger demanding further details. And then when the messenger finishes, he says, Bonaparte said to us that we no longer have a fleet. Well, he must either remain in this country or quit as it is as great as the ancients. On another account says, he was quite pissed off with the, brewers, but he actually does blame Blanquet more than anything.
That's ironic. It's always the guy who suggested not to do the thing that they did that gets blamed. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if he was blaming brewers, it's kind of like, Augustus blaming Varus to give him back his
Yeah.
allegiance.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, the French government actually reduces a lot of the blame on Blanquet later.
Hmm.
And a lot of criticism is, however, given to Villeneuve, this is just the first of his two battles with Nelson. Just add that. So, you know, but however, given the set of like some events, so the British don't actually hear about this in Britain till 2nd October. And that's because, there was a lot of, bad weather that affected the way to go. And then when, Nelson does return to England and he gives it to, Lord Spencer, the details, that man apparently collapsed in shock as if, guys, we can't have had such a great victory. But Nelson does um, get his peerage. He's now elevated to Baron Nelson of the Nile. Though he was quite pissed off with this. He says, I deserve more. But the British Parliament was like, yeah, because while you did have full independent command over this fleet, you were part of a fleet and not commanding the entire fleet because that was Earl St. Vincent.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And then later, Malta is going to be captured late by they rebel and the British take over. And when they get back, there's some of the ships that the French captured, sorry, the British captured. They had been bought into service, and you would be getting a lot of pay, which is then distributed to the crews of the ships that captured them. So the total value that the Royal Navy paid out for the capture of these prizes was 130,000 pounds back then, which in today's money is equivalent to 16 million. But keep in mind, I was reading in Nelson's early career as a lieutenant, he got 400 pounds alone from a lot of raiding and such. And that's was equivalent to like a fortune of owning a house. So it was quite a hefty thing. Nelson continued to be given showered with rewards. I'm pretty sure that must have at least stated his desire with, the rewards. Getting an annual pension of £2,000 a year for life by the Parliament of Britain and £1,000 per annum by the Parliament of Ireland. So this is in today's money about 400K a year in British pounds. And then, like all of them All of the captains and lieutenants of each ship were given, a special gold medal and everything. And, everyone got promotions, all those lieutenants. The initially, Culloden's men were excluded from receiving any equal share because that is the British ship that ran aground at the start of the battle. But Nelson intervened and said they will be given the same share as anyone of their rank. And this was actually a brilliant move because it really boosted Nelson's prestige amongst the lower officers in the Royal Navy and the men. The East India Company gave Nelson a 10,000 pound reward, and he got um, rewards from the Ottomans and Russia and Naples also. Like Naples gave him a triumph, and that's where Sir William Hamilton, the British ambassador to Naples, introduces Emma Hamilton to the third time to Nelson, who was a big lover of Nelson. They would have an affair, which actually would have some pretty interesting consequences for her personally, but that's not really the scope. But yeah, this was a really decisive battle because now the British who just a year ago had withdrawn, had just re-entered the Mediterranean after losing control in 1796. But the defeats that Earl St. Vincent were inflicted on the Spanish Navy in 1797 and Nelson at the Battle of the Nile in 1798 has completely altered the balance of power. Now, the British are going to maintain a strong fleet in the Mediterranean, and they're not going to be contested in Mediterranean dominance for, I think, this is going to last till the Second World War. So, in terms of that strategic sense, it was a decisive age of sail battle. Not only it also would force Napoleon into an unglamorous retreat back to France, although it works out well for Napoleon because he's able to launch his coup of 18 Brumaire, become the first consul of France and later emperor. And one thing I would know is say Nelson, whenever he did inflict these defeats on the French and Spanish, the long-term gains that Britain got from them was far. I don't think anyone would have ever imagined that. So yeah, I guess this is what I would say is like our first battle in the Battle of the Age of Sail and Napoleonic era.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think it is it's an I would say it should get as much credit as Trafalgar, but Trafalgar's gonna be, obviously put on that highest pedestal.
Yeah, it definitely. I mean,
I
it
mean,
is.
not without merit though.
Yeah, of course. It's a battle where
But
Nelson will also do something quite unorthodox and come out on top.
true. And I guess one thing that always works for Trafalgar is HMS Victory participated.
Hmm. I will like to mention, just because I was looking at information on this, apparently he brought some French crocodiles as presents to the king from this battle. And the illustration that they were showing, like, because the cartoons back then, wow, this is pretty comical. But yeah,
I mean, this is the first time I actually just noticed that cartoon because I've seen a lot of the British satire posts of the press that I'm against Napoleon,
yeah.
where I think I remember one particular cartoon showing William Pitt in a comical way, asking the kings of Europe, say, who wants to form a coalition against Bonnie the Corsican ogre?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we can bring this episode to an end, Craig.
All right, but before we go, I just want to repeat to the audience, if you'd like to further support the channel, please check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. Over there, you get access to the exclusive podcast. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Thank you, Gareth. This is a really exciting episode and pretty educated. A lot of education in there because I think a lot of people are not so. I don't know how popular the Age of Sail is these days, but it's a very interesting time period. And for naval battles, I mean, it's pretty exciting stuff. So this is really a lot of fun.
My pleasure, Craig, and looking forward to covering the other great naval battles of the era, not only Trafalgar.
Yeah, I was actually thinking right off the bat, this one really made me look, it's because of French ships. Made me think of the naval engagements the French had with the Chinese. So during the French Sino War, which no one talks about. There's some interesting battles there, and actually the French, I mean, they dominated it, but at some points the Chinese actually got a few licks in, so it's kind of interesting stuff. But till then, bye.